Welcome to week 4 in your sports psychology course. Today we're going to be looking at goal setting and motivation. As always, I'm Hayley Mason and I'm really looking forward to this lecture today. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was getting ready to present this lecture is the fact that I think most people will have an idea of what motivation and goal setting are. And I think if you kind of come into this lecture today with a closed mindset, as this can sometimes be a topic that can come across very basic and you might have already noticed yourself thinking like, I already know what motivation is and I already know what goal setting is. So if that's you, I just want you to take a moment today to maybe put aside at least some of the thoughts that you already have about goal setting and motivation. And hopefully open your mind to learning something new that you maybe didn't already know. Now, I can't speak into my personal experience in the field of sports psychology or working with athletes. However, goal setting is a large part of what I do as a kinesiologist, and often more so in the mental health space. One thing I've noticed that is quite common is people are very good at knowing what they don't want, or they tend to focus on wanting to get rid of anxiety, say for example. But then they often struggle to identify how to implement that into an achievable goal and discover why that's more important to them than staying where they are or with the experiences that they're having. So getting clear on their motivations. And so as humans, as athletes, as teachers and as students, we typically get very focused on setting certain types of goals, with the common one being outcome goals. And so I'm really excited to show you towards the end of this lecture today around what does the research actually say about what are the types of goals and what are the types of goals that are actually effective in terms of improving performance and in terms of impacting psychological factors such as self-efficacy, self-confidence, and satisfaction. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, some of your perspectives around goal setting and motivation may actually shift to what you already thought you knew. So let's get stuck into it for today. So as always, I want to acknowledge the people that are the traditional owners of the land and pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So I am based on the Gold Coast as I record this lecture, and I also want to extend that respect to the land and the original people of the land and the locations that you are joining this lecture from today. So here is the overview of how today's lecture will go. The topics have been separated into a focus on theories around motivation and then a focus on goal setting and what are the impact of certain types of goals on performance and psychological factors. Now, as I'm introducing some of these theories, I do just want to mention that this is not an exhaustive list of all the types of motivational theories and all the types of goal settings that's out there. A few key theories and a few key types of goal setting have been intentionally chosen in regards to what is most relevant to the sport and exercise psychology space. And I'll be presenting, particularly in the goal setting phase, a recent meta-analysis around studies of goal setting and what has been found to be the most effective types of goals. So the research on these topics have really been synthesized and filtered for you, but I do just want to mention that particularly motivation is such a big area of psychological study that to cover every single type of theory on motivation, we'd probably be here for quite a few hours. So just keep that in mind, that these are the key theories that I'm presenting and that are relevant to sport and exercise psychology. And they particularly have a very good scientific evidence-based backing from the research as well. But you may certainly come across other theories in this space as well, so just wanting to highlight that there. Okay, so we're going to begin by understanding motivational climates and their outcomes, specifically the theory around mastery-orientated climates versus performance-orientated climates. which produce vastly different psychological and behavioural outcomes, particularly in sports and education. And I just want to highlight here, as we're talking about motivational climate, we're talking about the environment that you facilitate. Now, as we're thinking about who maybe is one of the main drivers of that, really you're thinking about coaches. So often coaches are the main driver of what motivational climate they've facilitated. So we're going to be comparing the two types of motivational climates. The first type is the mastery-orientated climate, which you'll be able to see on the slide here. And this is a climate that is really supported by the research as having improved performance outcomes and other group processes like peer relationships. So with the mastery-orientated climate, the focus is really on rewarding and supporting effort, learning, and personal growth. So I think for a lot of you who are wanting to become teachers and are doing your studies, you probably would have heard about the idea of a growth mindset. This is the kind of motivational climate that is really designed to support that growth mindset. So the focus is really on learning and being willing to make a mistake in order to actually grow from it. A great example of a coach who deliberately facilitates a mastery-orientated climate is Chris Fagan, the head coach of the Brisbane Lions. He has created a mastery-orientated climate at the Brisbane Lions by focusing on continuous improvement, player empowerment, and emotional safety, rather than solely on immediate results. His approach is often described as educational and nurturing, emphasizes growth, learning from mistakes, and building trust, allowing players to develop resilience and reach their potential. Chris largely focuses on supporting effort, using trust as a motivation, empowering players, and shared leadership, demonstrating personal growth and learning, and prioritizing relationships over tactics. This led to their recent success, winning back-to-back premierships in 2024 and 2025. So I thought this was a great example of a head coach who clearly did a fantastic and deliberate job in creating an effective motivational climate within his team. And you might be able to identify other coaches or teachers who have a similar approach. So mastery-orientated climates are really focused on personal growth, work ethic, effort, learning, participation, and social interactions. So it's about working with each other, not against each other. Some other examples of this are getting athletes to set personal goals. Not a goal that is based on comparison, such as, am I better than someone else? Rather, it's about setting a personal goal and then having the coach providing that constructive feedback and fostering collaboration among teammates. So rather than having a coach that says something like, oh, well, you sucked out there today, or well, you didn't win. Instead, it's having a coach that asks themselves, what's constructive? Where are you putting your effort? So something such as, I could really see you communicating well with your teammates today. Well done. Or, your effort and focus in defense today was great. And as you would suspect, this is the type of motivational climate that is actually shown to be associated with increased effort that the individual has put in, increased adherence to training, and overall improved performance. So pretty much across the board, it's linked to some of those improvements that most team sports are actually trying to achieve, which is working together effectively, all teammates showing interest, satisfaction, and enjoyment, and decreased performance anxiety, because they're not necessarily focusing on things like being perfect. They're focusing on learning and growth. And that's where, in this type of motivational climate, we often see more of a willingness to approach a new task with high effort and high attention, versus in the next type of climate. We're going to talk about where people tend to then avoid because they don't want to make mistakes. So this is a really good environment to actually allow for mistakes and allow people to actually learn and grow from those mistakes because of that increased support that the coach provides and that feedback that they provide, being a really important part of that. So overall, the aim here is on growth and improvement as opposed to perfectionism, which, a lot of athletes already are going to be quite prone to wanting to be perfect. So the coach really needs to facilitate an environment that invites and allows for mistakes in order to grow. So as I've already referenced, the alternative to the mastery climate is the performance-oriented climate. And so this one's sometimes referred to as the ego-involving climate. So in terms of the performance-oriented climate, this one is really more focused on that interpersonal competition, where the emphasis is being on beating others and demonstrating superior ability rather than personal improvement. So kind of hitting athletes against each other in order to increase that motivation. This stems from environments where athletes perceive that rewards, recognition, and success are contingent on outperforming peers. Whilst it's intended to drive productivity and motivation, these climates often foster intense interpersonal competition, leading to a zero-sum atmosphere where one person's gain is perceived as another's loss. So the focus here is a lot more on winning, comparing yourself to others, and demonstrating abilities. So the athlete might be thinking, how good am I in this moment? And for some athletes who are quite ego-oriented in perhaps their personality traits, for a period of time, this can be a motivating climate. For example, there are going to be athletes that are going to really push themselves hard and be really motivated to try and be the best. Now, in saying that though, what the research suggests is that over time, it's not necessarily sustainable. And so what we find here is that it's often more linked to increased tension, pressure, anxiety, and a reduction in enjoyment. When we really think about this, it makes sense. When you're constantly pitted against others, it's a lot more likely that some of those not good enough thoughts are going to come up for you. Like if you're not at the top of the food chain in that team, you're potentially going to start to see yourself as not being very good. And so it can start to increase anxiety and that sense of pressure to perform. This climate has also shown to be linked to maladaptive outcomes, which are those unhelpful coping strategies such as training avoidance, dropout, or antisocial behaviours. As I'm sure you can imagine, this is generally not linked to great positive outcomes. And so what you can see here is a coach who's maybe facilitating a performance-oriented climate. They may be more prone to punishing mistakes or often viewing mistakes and errors negatively, leading to the fear of failure. And so athletes in this environment might be a lot more likely to engage in playing it safe, trying their best to be perfect, rather than being willing to make a mistake, because that mistake might be punished. As opposed to the master-oriented climate, which is really about learning and growth, this performance-based climate is more commonly associated with getting the athlete to perform at a level that they're at, but not necessarily facilitating further skill development. So if you want to kind of continue to improve over time, this performance-oriented climate is not necessarily what you want to be facilitating. And also, as we've talked about in some of those lectures previously, this type of climate is going to start to facilitate potentially where the athlete's attention is. So if you're constantly being compared to other athletes and you're constantly focusing on the outcome, this type of climate's asking, did you win? Therefore, what's your attention going to start focusing on? And as you know, we talked a little bit previously in terms of attention and how that's not what the research suggests is linked to the best way to achieve optimal performance. And so, as you would expect, this type of performance-oriented climate is not as effective at facilitating those desired performance outcomes. So overall, performance-oriented climates are environments where success is defined by winning, superiority, and normative comparison, with an emphasis on rewarding top performers and penalizing errors. These climates are frequently created by coaches or leaders focusing on outcomes over effort, which often lead to higher anxiety, reduced enjoyment, and high levels of emotional exhaustion or increased risk of burnout. So as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, we're going to cover a couple of different theories on motivation. This is an alternate theory of motivation that has a lot of evidence to support it. And it's really looking at how our psychological needs are met in order to support motivation. So when we think about self-determination theory, it assumes that people are prone towards psychological growth. And the fact here is that most people are going to want to tend towards that, but the assumption is that it doesn't always happen automatically, and that the environment needs to be set up to facilitate certain psychological needs being met in order to be able to actually reach that growth. So if we think about it, you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where it refers to individuals being motivated to fulfill basic, more functional needs at the bottom of the pyramid, before being able to move to a higher level growth needs, such as esteem and self-actualization. So you have to start at the bottom and you can't move up towards higher needs until those basic needs are met. So once we've met these basic psychological needs, then we can move towards psychological growth and thriving. But we have to have these basic psychological needs met first. And the idea of self-determination theory is that by facilitating an environment that helps to support autonomy, competence, and relatedness as some of our basic psychological needs, that this actually facilitates moving towards intrinsic motivation. Shortly, we will look at the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in more depth, but I'm sure you're already starting to clue on to what type of motivation is linked to the best performance outcomes. So the three basic needs that are posited as fundamental part of the self-determination theory are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy is the idea that individuals have a sense of ownership over their own actions. So if we think about an example of this, we're thinking about maybe the athlete having some choice over what they're actually doing at training, as opposed to a coach that basically will tell them everything they have to do, and they have absolutely no choice in it, even if maybe they have an injury and they need to adapt. An environment that supports autonomy will give the athlete some ownership over adaptations that they might make, for example. Whereas an environment that doesn't support autonomy is more likely to just be quite rigid, where the athlete is told what they need to do, and even if they disagree with it, or even if it goes against what they think is going to be helpful, they just don't have any say in it. It's the idea of it being externally controlled, and this could be through things such as rewards and punishment when we're going against autonomy. So if you're trying to support it, we're looking at ways to support interest and valuing the activity in itself rather than looking for the external rewards. Similarly to autonomy, we have competence, which is that the personal sense of I can succeed and grow, where an individual can feel like they're moving towards mastering a skill or task. And as you can probably already see, some of the terms like mastering overlap across theories. So when we're thinking about competence, it's about understanding the importance and knowing ways to instill self-belief so that the individual believes that they can improve, grow, and ultimately succeed. And so this is best fostered within really well-structured environments that provide optimal challenges, positive feedback, and opportunities for growth. So the environment does need to be structured in a way that really encourages the ability for that person to feel like they're growing, feel like they're moving towards mastery. So as I mentioned, like optimal challenges, you can't set a challenge for someone that's on either extreme and expect them to build self-belief and confidence within themselves. So if you set a challenge that's super easy, that's probably not going to support that design for competence. Just as if you were to set a challenge that's far out of that person's ability. So as a coach or a sports psychologist, you would really want to be looking at designing optimal challenges that push and challenge the individual, whilst ensuring it's something that they can actually overcome and feel that sense of competence through. The other facilitator of competence is positive feedback. This aligns with the idea of constructive feedback. So rather than the coach always telling the person what they're doing wrong, it's actually looking at what can they improve on, but also what they're actually doing well and where they're putting their effort. So hopefully from this you can see that the integral role that facilitating a sense of competence plays in motivation. Because if you think about it, if someone is engaging in a task and feels absolutely hopeless at it, how long are they going to persist in that task? People are a lot more likely to participate and persist in a task that they feel like they're improving at and that they feel they have a chance at getting quite good at it in order to succeed. The final one is relatedness. So this is that basic human need for connection. I think across psychology, this one, it comes up all the time. We're naturally motivated for connection. Our brains are actually hardwired for it. So if we think about how to facilitate this, we're thinking about how do we facilitate things like respect and caring amongst a group. And so there are really simple ways that coaches can do this. I think a lot of you will have been a part of team sports where maybe they do something outside of the training sessions. Maybe they do a team barbecue or a pre-season gathering. A lot of the time with professional teams, they get together and do team building tasks too. It's all really designed to create that sense of relatedness. One thing I want to mention here is that as we're in sports psychology lecture, a lot of the examples I'm providing are linked to sport and performance. However, I do want to highlight, particularly for those studying teaching, there is a ton of research really supporting self-determination theory in educational settings. So you might like to have a think about how this theory could apply in the classroom and how your role as a teacher could support and enable these needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So this idea of self-determination theory and motivation, it goes across just sport. It's really talking about the human being. But as we are in sport psychology, the focus is around how does this influence performance. So to really hone in on the points being made, we're now going to watch this video from the Australian Sports Commission, which gives some really practical examples around how we can facilitate some of these basic psychological needs and what the difference is between quite a controlling environment versus an autonomy supported environment.
From a psychological perspective, motivation is a process that causes the arousal, direction and persistence of behaviour, typically towards a voluntary goal. More generally though, Motivation is the degree to which an individual wants and tries to complete a particular task. For example, it explains the difference between a coach who's leading a training session that's engaging and ensures that every one of their participants are developing their own performance, to one that's just there and doing it to get paid. So it's just that both have different motivations.
It generally comes down to the question of why we would do one thing potentially over and above other things. So we're always trying to get to answering the question of why, and you need to get to the understanding of people's why, and that might be people you're working with or your own why, and you need to uncover that and bring it to the surface so that you can actually compare and understand each individual's why, and that usually drives their behaviour and the way they engage in that behaviour. The way motivation is ultimately brought out and enacted is in the interaction with the environment. So even when we understand people's needs and we've finally uncovered all of those, it's completely possible to set up a session or an event which doesn't facilitate those needs being met. And so what we're actually looking for is the matchup of the moment and the session or the event with that person's needs. And it can be informative to work out, well, the reason this isn't working is because the rules of the situation don't allow us to meet that person's needs, for example. And then you might have to think how we help that person or find a different way of getting them involved.
There are a number of theories that try to explain what motivates a person. One of the more popular theories is what we know as the self-determination theory. In simple terms, it's a theory of motivation that's concerned with supporting our intrinsic needs, and those are having autonomy over what we do, feeling confident, and also building connections with others. Now, the major difference with the self-determination theory and others is that it focuses on the type of motivation that somebody has rather than how much. It can be either autonomous, so typically behaviours that are considered more intrinsic, like enjoyment or personal improvement, or it can be controlled, and those are more often behaviours that are performed because of external influences like rewards or a fear of punishment.
So when we're answering that why question, it's extraordinarily diverse, but at the same time you can classify these whys into three broad categories. So generally people like to feel competent, like we can achieve the outcomes we want to achieve and we can influence our environment. So if we're feeling that we can be successful and we can achieve things, that's one of the key things that makes people feel good. And likewise, we like to feel connected to other people, whether we feel we have relationships, we're valued, we're part of a group that values us and we're bonded with that group. That connection to other people is really important. And then we like to feel like we're in control. So we actually are not just kind of passively pawns in a game, but we're actually able to make decisions, enact those decisions, and it's our will that's being enacted, at least in some areas of life.
Now, there's lots of different ways a coach can try and create an environment that encourages their participants to lean more towards autonomous motivation. For example, to try and have participants feeling confident about their performance or development. It can be as easy as using clear and understandable communication about expectations that you or they might have and checking in with them to see how they're going compared to these expectations. It's all about making sure that the participants are focused on comparing within themselves as opposed to other teams, other participants, etc. Now, with autonomy, you can provide participants with more options about the activities, the rules, the direction of a session. Basically get them involved in the decision-making and the development process of a session. Giving participants more information about things like the activities or why they're doing something can also make them feel aware of what's going on and why. And with relatedness, because it's all about building a connection with your participants, simple things like learning more about them, being more personable and relatable to who they are, not always being serious and focusing on what's happening in the session really helps with this.
I think once you get into game situations, all of these things are kind of furiously, dynamically interacting, and so you want to get to the point where you've got teams of individuals or the individuals themselves able to make life decisions and take control and therefore feel autonomy and enact those decisions and therefore feel competence. And sometimes delivering on those things in the long-term perspective is more important than the scoreboard.
Now I know this probably looks quite complex, and I'm very aware of just trying to communicate a key point here with this diagram. So the key point that I want to get across is that the self-determination theory highlights motivation on a continuum. So on the left-hand side, we can see a motivation or a lack of motivation, and then on the far right-hand side, we've got intrinsic motivation, with extrinsic motivation in the middle. So I don't want you to worry too much about the different types of extrinsic motivation, because that's getting very in-depth and more at a high level. But I do just want to highlight that as we go from the left to the right, we go from more external motivation to more external perceived locus of control to more internal. So when we're thinking about going from external to internal, we're thinking about what's actually supported by the research as being more beneficial for things such as performance outcomes. So when we think about intrinsic motivation, we're really thinking about having an interest and enjoyment and inherent satisfaction with the task at hand. You're doing it because you genuinely want to do it and you genuinely enjoy it. And so even within extrinsic motivation, it goes from the left with external rewards or punishment, or external kind of activity, towards more internal. So maybe that extrinsic motivation is actually moving towards what's more important for you. And so a really good example of this is within extrinsic motivation. As you're moving towards the more internal locus of causality or locus of control, we're talking about what's actually important to the individual. So in terms of extrinsic, you might find a task is quite worthwhile to do, and you're motivated to do it because it's consistent with your values, but you're not necessarily enjoying it. You're not doing it for the sake of enjoyment. You're doing it because you see it as a worthwhile and as consistent, it's consistent with your values. And so that would still be under extrinsic, but it's definitely moving towards that intrinsic motivation. And so what I really, just as a broad brushstroke, want to highlight is that motivation can be thought of as on a continuum, going from a motivation to extrinsic motivation to intrinsic. The research suggests that intrinsic motivation is the most effective for performance, for exercise adherence, for athletes actually getting that satisfaction and longevity in the sport. But this is not a black and white situation. It's not as though all types of extrinsic motivation are absolutely bad and you can never use them. No, it's just suggesting that the more we can move towards internal motivations, the more likely it's going to facilitate that exercise adherence or that ongoing motivation for that person. Whereas if we think about on the left-hand side of the extrinsic, if it's very reward or punishment based, the athlete might do a run because you say, if you do the run, I'll give you a lolly at the end. But they're less likely to continue to engage in that run afterwards once that reward or punishment is gone. Whereas on the other side of extrinsic motivation, if you're providing and facilitating an environment that supports moving more into internalization, so it's important to the individual and relevant to their values, they're going to be a lot more likely to continue engaging and stay motivated for a longer period of time. So that's the identification one, and they see it as linked to their goals. So I know this one looks quite complex. I'm not expecting you to remember the different types of extrinsic motivation necessarily, but I just want you to know that motivation is on a continuum, and it's really important that we're moving towards more internal versus external, because that's what the research suggests is most beneficial for those psychological outcomes and performance outcomes long term. So I think I've highlighted the different types of motivations here, so I won't elaborate on this too much. But this is the 3 broad types of motivation that I want you to remember. Overall, I just want you to remember there's intrinsic motivation, so getting that inherent pleasure and satisfaction derived from the activity itself. Extrinsic motivation is doing something big for a particular reason as a means to some end, rather than just because you really want to do it or because you really enjoy it. And it's really based on the activity itself. And then that amotivation, where you're not actually motivated to do it at all. It doesn't fit with what's important to you, and you're not necessarily getting any kind of even external rewards that would actually motivate you towards doing that thing or that task. So yeah, those are the 3 types that the self-determination theory are based on. And remembering we're using the facilitation of basic psychological needs to move us as much as possible towards that intrinsic motivation. Now, goal setting. So we've probably gone through quite a lot in terms of motivation, and I really hope that we've hit some of those key points there. And in the next slide, I'm going to tie together some of the goals that actually link to types of motivation and how effective they are. So what you can see on the slide here in some of the key practical applications of what types of goals we would traditionally set in a performance psychology or sports psychology space. And I'm actually going to do a little bit of an activity with you. Now, obviously this is a recording and you can't respond to me in the moment, but as I'm going through the definitions, I want you to start to think for yourself, which type of goal do you expect to be the most evidence-based? So which type of goal do you expect to be linked to the most benefits in terms of performance enhancement and different psychological factors such as building self-efficacy or satisfaction or interest in the activity? So as I go through, keeping that in mind, noticing what you predict. So overall, goal setting as an intervention has been linked to improvements in performance by directing athletes' attention towards relevant tasks and increasing persistence in the face of obstacles. So this really beautifully links to some of the previous lectures I've talked about in terms of sports psychology being a game of attention. So if we can link our goals to direct the athletes towards what's relevant and enable them to continue to move in that direction despite obstacles in their way, we're going to go a long way to moving that athlete towards what's going to be beneficial for both their performance and their well-being. In regards to goals, the same applies as the theories, in that there are more types of goals than the ones I'm mentioning in the slide. And I'm going to reference a couple other ones in the next slide as well. But these are the 3 core types of goals that you'll come across quite a lot and that you can utilize when working with athletes or students. So the first one is our process goal. So a process goal relates to what an athlete focuses on when performing a specific skill. A way to explain a process goal to an athlete is to explain and get them to think about it in regards to how much control they have over the skill or task. So you could explain a process goal as being more in your control. What can you focus on when performing a specific skill that you have total control over? So a really good one is a cue word. So setting a process goal to focus on executing a cue word or a keyword when performing a skill. So that person has the ability to control their attention and the ability to focus on a particular skill while performing it. This is a really important one to support the athlete to really hone in on what the actual process is for what they're trying to do well, which is performing a skill that improves their performance. Now this as opposed to a performance goal. So when we're thinking about a performance goal, we're thinking about focusing on a specific task outcome. So within their performance, getting the athlete to really break it down into achieving a certain task. And so the way you could explain this one is by helping them to understand that it's about a level of control they have over it, as they still have some influence. They still have sub-control, but they don't necessarily have complete control because they're looking at a task outcome. So this one may sometimes be a little bit more confusing for athletes to get their head around, but really the aim of the performance goal is making the instruction to be a chunk of the performance that you're working on together to see whether they're successful and performing well at that specific task. So it could be so many different things. An example in surfing could be, I will increase my wave count to at least 10 waves per hour by improving my paddle endurance through specific interval training. And then at the end of the training session, or at the end of the week, the coach would then tell them their wave count per hour, for example. Another example for netball could be, I will land safely with balanced footwork on 100% of my landing attempts, ensuring no stepping calls. Now, they don't have complete control over those goals, do they? And hopefully from those examples, you can start to see how different sports are going to bring different elements and levels of control too. However, both examples still have some level of control with their goals. And so that performance goal is really enabling the athlete to identify a component of their performance and see how effective they are in executing a component of the performance. Whereas the outcome goal would be something such as to achieve a total heat score of at least 10 points in my next competition, or did you win the comp? For netball, it could be something such as being selected for the national team. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And in our tutorials, we'll go through some activities so that we can really practice setting some different types of process, performance, and outcome goals to assist with getting our head around it. But if you think about it in this way, process goals, you should have complete control over whether you can actually execute that goal. Whereas a performance goal, you have some control over, and then outcome goals, you have even less control. Obviously, you have some level of control as you're engaging your body, but with outcome goals, if you think about competing against Usain Bolt in 100 meters, you can't control how fast Usain Bolt goes compared to how you go. So yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it is based on what level of control process is the most, performance is next, and then outcome is least. So now that you've learnt those definitions, I want you to come back to think about which type of goal do you think is going to be linked to be the most effective for overall performance. And so I'll just give you a moment before I move on to the next slide to have a think about that. This is a meta-analysis that was done in 2022 with roughly over 1,000 different studies on goal setting, around the effect of goal setting on performance and different psychological effects that are relevant to performance. As I share some of the findings from this research, you might notice that they challenge or reinforce some of your previous beliefs or understandings, which is a great aspect of meta-analysis. So the first key finding is that the process goals appear to be the most effective goal type for enhancing performance. It was also the most effective for improving psychological factors such as self-efficacy, intrinsic interest, and satisfaction. So there's some huge domains there, and process goals, even compared to performance goals, based on the study so far, were the most effective in enhancing performance in sport. So that might suggest to us that process goals could be a really good one to focus on with athletes or students. Now, even though I'm saying that is not to say that you never worry about using any other type of goal, because process goals win out. No, other types of goals, especially performance goals, actually also do have a good evidence base behind them. And for things such as a reduction in anxiety symptoms and an increase in self-confidence, performance goals were actually shown to be effective. So performance goals were also shown to be effective in enhancing performance overall, just not quite as much as process goals. And so when we think about performance goals, it makes sense that they would help improve self-confidence and improve that effort and satisfaction. Because if you're getting feedback that what you're doing is working, that's going to build self-confidence. And so it's really useful to incorporate both process and performance goals so that the athlete actually gets some feedback on what they're doing is working. Because if you only use process goals, the athlete might not be getting that positive feedback around a component of performance to know that they're actually achieving the small tasks that make up the overall result. So you might like to think of ways you could use that combination of both process and performance goals as an ideal combo when it comes to goal setting and improving performance. Mastery goals. So if we think about the motivation climate that we talked about earlier, the mastery versus performance or ego-orientated climates. So mastery goals were deemed to be more effective than ego goals for reducing anxiety and increasing engagement, which I think you guys probably would have picked up that based on earlier in the lecture when we were talking about the fact that mastery goals really support learning and growth, whereas those ego or comparison goals can actually facilitate an increase in anxiety. So overall, when we're thinking about types of goals, the performance and process goals have the most significant positive effects. And unfortunately, the goals that are more outcome or ego-based had a limited effect. Now, once again, this is not to say that you could never use it, and it's important to consider that some athletes particularly would really struggle if you never kind of identified what outcome they're working towards. Some people may still find that quite useful. And overall, I think you really need to make sure that you're tailoring your intervention to the individual in front of you. So hopefully there were some aspects within today's topics and the research findings that you weren't necessarily aware of. You're probably aware that there's all these types of goals, but perhaps you never necessarily knew which is more effective and for what. So hopefully this becomes useful and guides you to identify, what am I trying to achieve with an athlete or an individual? And how can I use this research to best guide my intervention? And what kind of goal I might set. For example, if you're looking at trying to increase effort, you might actually be looking at performance goals. Or if we're looking at building intrinsic interest, you would lean towards creating a process goal. And for overall satisfaction, you would use a combination of both process and performance, as they both show positive effects in this. I think overall, you generally want to do a combination, because if you're using one, then you may not be getting the benefit of the other one as well. But potentially steer away more so from very particular ego goals that may actually move the athlete away from focusing on what's important to them. You'll notice in this picture of Jess Fox, gold medal winning kayaker, that her main coach has been her mother, who, like her father, was also an Olympic kayaker. So parents and teachers at school are generally children's first coaches. You have a big responsibility to help young athletes to be self-determining by providing opportunities for them to develop their autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So in this slide, we're going to bring it all together because I know that we've covered a lot of different information. We've covered two quite important topics of motivation and goal setting. And so I just want to give you a little bit of an overview and summarize what's really important. So on the first point, coaches have a large role to play in facilitating motivational climates. This is where sports psychologists can also play a significant role in actually working alongside coaches to upskill them in understanding some of these theories, particularly the self-determination theory, because you can educate those coaches in how they can help to support the basic psychological needs of their athletes. You could use this theory to highlight that evidence suggests that focusing on facilitating those needs moves the athlete towards intrinsic motivation, which is linked to overall positive outcomes for performance, as well as satisfaction and enjoyment in the activity within itself, which I'm sure most coaches would be pretty happy knowing that they can improve their skills to facilitate this. Goal setting can facilitate performance gains, and it can also positively influence intrinsic motivation. So if we tie it all together, when we're thinking about motivation and goals, really thinking about how process goals in particular will link to facilitating that intrinsic interest in the task. But also performance goals can also support increased satisfaction and an increase in effort, which is what's moving us along that continuum we talked about. That continuum of motivation, moving from a motivation towards extrinsic motivation, towards the goal of intrinsic motivation. Lastly, highlighting that with goal setting, we really want to tailor it to the individual, but we want to be evidence-based in what we're doing. So yeah, hopefully as I've been communicating throughout these lectures, the theme should be coming across very clearly in regards to our attention with our goal setting, and if we're directing our resources towards what matters and what's task relevant in the moment for performance, then we can suggest that we're moving towards those performance outcomes and benefits, as well as increasing that sense of satisfaction, engagement, and interest in the task. Here is a list of the readings that you have for this week. You should be able to find them in the recommended readings to further develop your understanding of goal setting and self-determination theory in regards to sports psychology. So thank you so much for your engagement today. We'll go through particularly some of these practical applications of goal setting in our tutorials, and I'm also definitely going to attach the goal setting meta-analysis in your additional recommended readings, because that's just such an excellent resource if you're ever looking at goal setting for assignments or even in the future. So have a look at that. I'll put it on the Canvas site. And yeah, thank you all for your attention, and I really look forward to seeing you, particularly you Gold Coasters, in the tutorials later this week. Thank you.